All right, folks. Well, you're in for a treat when you hear that tune. It always puts a smile on my face to hear the rhythm and blues of Peter Trulin, because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Reed, Bluff Torini in the home game and at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. And I have the best freaking job in the world talking poker with my friends here on the strategy edition of the podcast every Monday night while we steal each other's chips in the free nightly home game. I have to thank our sponsors, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. Find out more about them at runaces.com. Most of what we do here is free. We're a largely volunteer-based organization, so we depend on support from our sponsors and also from our premium members who take part in our training material and study opportunities for only $15 a month. So if that sounds like the kind of thing you'd enjoy, talking poker with friends and studying the same stuff as other people do, studying, celebrating, playing together, and having fun, then it's less than 50 cents a day here at Rec Poker, $15 a month, but you can get your first month for only $5 using the code Rec Poker at checkout. Now, they let me host the show on Monday nights, but I'm just one man, and it takes a group, a gang, a crew to make all the magic happen around here. We call this group of wizards the Wrecking Crew. If you want to find out more about me and the rest of the Wrecking Crew, you can go to rec.poker/crew, or you can just listen up and you'll meet a few of them here tonight on the show, starting with producing co-host Chris Jones.
Well, I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5b5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the Poker Stars home game.
And I'm Keith Brandt. That's you'll find me at Monkey System just about everywhere, and I facilitate Monkeys off table tools here at Rec Poker.
And I'm Rob Washam. You can find me as Rabman50 just about everywhere. And the first and third Wednesdays of each month, you can find me hosting the book study.
So this is the forums edition of the podcast, and every week we invite premium members to come and join the show. That's just one of the perks of being a premium member here at Rec Poker, and I'm happy to have a premium member, Eric Anderson, back on the show to talk a little strategy with us tonight. Eric, thanks for coming on the show. Where can folks recognize you, and where can they get a hold of you in Rec Poker Nation?
Probably the best way to find me is just right on the Rec Poker website, Anderson85.
So we're going to be looking at a post today from 7high11, John Crowell, longtime member and a fantastic guy. He says, this is about a nut flush draw dilemma. So if I'll introduce the hand here, and then I think we'll find a few rabbit holes on each and every street. So John writes in the forums, nut flush draws are definitely a weak spot in my strategy. I hear and read so much about playing them aggressively, but when I do, I just seem to lose money hand over fist. Maybe it's because I have a bias toward only remembering the losses. This is a ignition tournament. It's a $15 plus $1.50 rake, 9-person sit and go triple up. So in this format, it starts with 9 players, and the top 3 players triple up. They're $15. The second hand of the tournament, it's 10-20 blinds, 1,500 starting stacks, so about 75 big blinds deep. Our correspondent is in the small blind. Under the gun opens to 2x. We get a call from early position, a couple folds, the hijack calls, the cutoff calls, the button folds, and we are looking down with the ace-4 of clubs. So let's start the action here. We're in the small blind. And without revealing what John does, he says, it's not unusual for ignition hands to go multi-way to the flop. I know a lot of people like to 3-bet with suited wheel aces, but I only like to do it from late position, and I'm in the small blind here. There's already 4 people in the pot. John says, on this side, I'm likely to get at least 3 calls from a standard size 3-bet, and I don't think that's great for me out of position. Should I consider a really large 3-bet, a call, or even a fold? So I'll open it up to the group here. The first thing that jumps out to me is when you're playing in a squeeze spot like this, where you've got an open in front and several calls, you're going to want to size up to than a typical size of a 3-bet because it's multi-way. And then being out of position, you would also want to size up. So I think of that might affect the hands that you choose to make a 3-bet with, but when you do, you definitely want to size up considerably more than if it was just a single player pot. Chris Jones, what's on your mind?
Well, the one piece of this that I want to just challenge John's thinking, or help us maybe think about this in a slightly different way is he says, but I only like to do that from late position. And I guess my question would be why? I mean, I'd like to do everything from late position. I agree, because that's great, because then we get position as the hand progresses. But if I'm going to have the worst position at the table, um, I would like to take some initiative with a hand that has some nice qualities to it. Um, and yeah, I think so. I could fold this. I'd be okay folding this. I'm okay calling it too. It's a hand that plays fairly well. We have to know what we're getting ourselves into when we call and we go 5 ways. We're looking to hit a nut flush or a nut flush draw, really. Maybe a wheel or something, but we're not really looking to hit an ace. We're not really looking to hit, a lot of, like a 4 is kind of like, but I like to squeeze in these spots. I think there is a lot of dead money if we go big. And I think we can get people to fold a decent amount. And I want to maybe just ask the group here, because like I think the other thing that we want to be thinking about is we're playing in a sit and go triple up. So there is a little incentive to um, play these somewhat differently than you would if this was just like a sit and go, or standard sit and go, or even a tournament. And I think that might even push us a little bit more towards some potential squeezes here early.
Yeah, it's a very different element when it's just the game stops when you get down to three-handed, as opposed to needing to accumulate more chips and most of the money being at the top of the tournament. I think that's a great factor to be considering, and how the other players are playing. So you'd actually expect this to be a less passive player pool, but that's only if they're actually playing it correctly, which is a bad assumption to make. Eric Anderson, you unmuted first, and then Rob. What's on your mind?
I kind of wanted to go off of what Chris said about the 3-betting with the wheel aces. He like you mentioned it. He liked to do it from late position. I'm kind of just the opposite. I like to do it to people in late position because they have the wider ranges. They're going to fold more when they get 3-bet. And then you have more implied odds also because they're more likely to, in the later positions, to get a flush over flush.
Mm.
And also the I've never really played these triple ups before, but I would say ICM is a big factor. So actually, a call probably is a good thing here, where just surviving is a good thing. You only need 1 chip to get in 3rd place, and that's all you need.
Good point. Rob?
Yeah, I think I agree with Chris. I think this is a spot where I would like to squeeze. I would like to start this hand as the aggressor with fewer people in pot. And I think we're going to get some folds if we bet larger. I mean, we're starting with 75 big blinds, so we're pretty deep. We're not at risk of having to push all in unless we happen to hit our flop the way we want. But at the same time, I would rather look at this or go into this hand with fewer opponents and as the aggressor. So that's the reason you squeeze. And it doesn't matter if you're in a sit and go, a triple up like this, or an MTT. It's the same principle applies. You want to go to a flop with fewer opponents, especially out of position.
Keith?
Yeah, I was wondering what kind of sizing we would go with here, because we've got the open razor under the gun, and then we've got under the gun plus 1 called, and then 2 more calls after that. So there's still 4 people that have raised or called and under the gun raise. Nobody raised the under the gun raise, but and then the big blind is still yet to act.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to go pretty big.
Yep.
our squeeze size. What kind of size were you guys thinking about?
Chris?
I'd go 15 to 16 big blinds here. Probably 16.
Yeah, that's big because and so you need to put these other players to a difficult decision by having a big size like that. Otherwise, if you make it too small, then you're giving them pretty good odds on calling in position. And as soon as one of them does, then the next players are going to have even better odds to call in position. And they've already displayed an interest in seeing a pot in position when they called the original open. So Chris's 15 or 16 big blinds to an open of 2, it might sound larger than you're expecting on paper in a vacuum, but when you factor in all the different players that you have to get folds from and being out of position, I think that that big sizing is really, really important.
Yeah, because there's already, what is there? There's if we
Like
count,
9.5. Yeah.
there's 8 plus our small blind and a not there's 9.5 in the middle already.
Yeah. And so people are in for 2. So if you make it let's say 16, then you're putting people to a very to a real decision. Now they're going to have to call an extra 14 big blinds to win a pot that's got about 23, 24 in there. So I really like the size.
And
Yeah, Chris?
I would be, John says that we usually go 4 or 5 ways in this, but I would be pretty shocked if that happened here. I mean, it could happen. People are fairly like, I want to see a flop, and they can be fairly, but honestly, that's okay too. I mean, this is a hand that does have some very strong nut ability in it, and I mean, okay, let's be the aggressor in a pot that's big, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and we did
this
choose.
it is a
Yeah, go
bluff,
ahead,
so
yeah.
it's great. It is a bluff,
Yeah.
so it's great if we get a fold. We can take those 9 big blinds.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
I always start my 3 bets with a pot size bet. You hit your hand 32% of the time. You bet a pot, you're giving them 33% odds. You really shouldn't 3 bet less than that unless it's later in the tournament.
Keith, do you have something there?
Yeah, and if we do get extra callers in this thing and we do hit, I mean, we could be close to winning this thing after this first hand.
True. Yep. Yeah, so I think when we were first talking about the hand, again, we just look at what you're getting on this podcast is a real-time reaction from our group to the material in front of us. When we first looked at it, I was thinking like 12 to 13 big blinds. I think Chris is right to size up a little bit. And so what's the smallest amount we would ever consider making this? I don't know. Is it 12? Is that even too small, Rob?
12 is the smallest. I was thinking
Yeah.
15,
Yeah.
but 12 would be a normal size, I think, in this configuration. But I like Chris's point of making it bigger, so I would probably go to 15 is what I was originally thinking, but 16 is right there. I like that because it doesn't, people can't call that as easily.
And that matters in a spot like this with these multiple players. I think
Yeah.
sizing up a little extra is actually really valuable here because I think it does increase your fold equity disproportionately for how many more chips you're actually putting in the middle. Yeah,
And
Chris?
the other thing is I do, I get frustrated too with some of these like passive games where people are just always calling you and you're just always going to hands 4 and 5 ways and you don't, but like this is one of those times and spots where I think that sizing can start to reduce that. I mean, I think people are size sensitive in some cases, and I think this is one of those where I think we can go big and it can work. I mean, if this goes heads up or even 3-way, we've done a lot to help ourselves out.
Yeah,
And go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, you're sending a message to those other players that made the call. You're gonna punish flop bingo. And that's a good message to send.
Yeah, especially early in the tournament, right?
Yep.
You can set the tone there. I also think, we mentioned at the beginning, if we are going to choose a larger sizing, that might mean that we 3-bet a narrower range. So we're not going to be doing this with all these different 3-bet candidates that we would make a typical 3-bet with. But you can't just do it with the best hands. And this ace-5 suited, ace-4 suited hands, they are the best candidates to balance that value 3-betting range. So I would encourage players, if you're thinking, oh, but there's no point in bluff 3-betting in the games that I'm playing in. I mean, okay, it's fantastic. Then it's a patience game, and you can just only hammer it when you have extremely high hands. If people are going to call all the time, but this is a really good candidate to take that spot to try and steal some of this dead money. And we chose this hand for a reason. It's got blocker value. It can make a straight. It can make the nut flush. So I think it's a good hand to consider when people do this. Any other
Another
thoughts
thing
on
to
3-betting? Yeah, Eric. Yeah.
Well, just the thing to notice when you said that this is a game where there's no reason to 3-bet because everybody calls me. Those same people are the same people that'll never 2x the pot or 3x the pot. It's like if they're always going to call you and you have the nuts, just shove it. And if they're going to call you, they're going to call you.
Right.
And the last thing I'd say is sort of the opposite of what John said. Like, if I was the button, I would much rather potentially flat this. Whereas he said he only likes to do it from late position. So, like, I would rather flat this against 5 players and have ultimate position. Because the tricky thing about this kind of hand is when you nail this flop, you want to get paid. And if we hit our flush, it's so much easier to get paid if we have position against multi-way players than if we're playing 5 players and we're in the small blind and we hit our flush. Like, it's going to be so hard to get stacks in. It's just people get scared of flushes and whatever, and that's why I think it's actually this, because we're in the small blind, it makes it a much more compelling squeeze spot to me.
Yep. And I would say that so we talked before about 3-betting some, calling some, folding some. Unless I knew the player to my left was very aggressive and likely to take this squeeze spot if I called, that's the only reason I could see myself folding in this spot. If I'm able to actually get to a flop with a hand like this, then there's an argument for 3-betting that we've all talked about here. And I think you can call as well sometimes. But you, like Chris mentioned at the top, you have to think about this. You're sort of playing it like a pocket pair. You're either going to make 2-pair, a flush draw, or a flush, or trip 4s, I guess. But those are the only ways that you're going to feel good about continuing. So it's sort of like you're not set mining with a low pocket pair, but you're like flush mining, or very strong draw mining. And if you don't make those kind of hands, well, you know me, Chris. Strong draws are basically a made hand, as far as I'm concerned. Sometimes I prefer them. And Chris is saying he'd rather do that in late position because it's easier to extract value. It is. And I know some players don't like to bloat the pot out of position by 3-betting in spots like this, but we've already made the arguments for 3-betting. But yeah, you could fold if the player to your left is very active, or if you want to call, I don't mind that every once in a while. Do anything else before we get on to the flop? We found about a 15-20 minute rabbit hole for the pre-flop action. So John does call and talks about his hesitance to squeeze in this spot because it's likely to go multi-way. And again, the last thing I'll say about that is it's likely to go multi-way no matter what. Would you rather go multi-way with range advantage? And if players are just going to call all the time, what that means is that they get post-flop with weak ranges if they don't fold pre-flop to 3-bets. Which means that they don't hit a lot of flops, which means that you can take it away on more flops when players do continue with weak ranges. So them calling your 3-bet isn't always the end of the world. It just means that they get to a future street with a weaker range that maybe you can take it away there. Okay, so John calls and the big blind folds. Amazing that they did get in. That's really very disciplined fold from the big blind. the flop is the 3 of clubs, 10 of spades, 4 of diamonds. Again, we've got the ace, 4 of clubs. So we've got a second pair, backdoor wheel draw, backdoor nut flush draw, and I guess technically also the backdoor straight flush draw. So now the pot has 11 big blinds into it, and we are 5-handed. We're the first to act. The flop is 3, 10, 4, like I say, rainbow. John says, I don't donk much, but with 2 really low cards, this definitely hits my range better. And I do have a pair with some backdoor potential. How do people act here? I think it's very natural in the flow of a tournament to just check 100% of our range here when we're out of position and it goes multi-way, and sort of like letting the natural flow of the hand determine if the imposition players are going to bet. But as John says, this is a pretty good board for us with on 10, 10, 4, 3. Although we are in the small blind. It's not like we're in the big blind where we have a lot of 4s and 3s. I think the small blind continuing range is actually a little smaller. Maybe we don't smash this board as much as John thinks that we do. Rob, you unmuted first. What's on your mind?
Well, I don't like the donk bet at all. I think this is a automatic because we called. Because we called, our range can be a lot bigger than a normal if we had 3-bet, for instance. So this really does could smash our range a lot better just because we did call in the small blind. So as played. So I would be looking at this flop and I'd be chomping at the bit to check and then raise to any bet that somebody makes. Because like you say, this flop is going to be 10 times better for my range than it is for the original openers.
And Rob, on a 10, 4, 3, it's hard for a lot of these opponents to have much other than a pair of 10s. It would be like the strongest hand that you'd expect for a lot of people. You don't expect them to have a lot of straight draws. It's a rainbow board, so you don't expect them to have a lot of flush draws.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to, ace 10, maybe somebody might have an ace 10 out of that. Somebody could pair their
really
some of these callers could pair their 3s or 4s.
Yeah, in really passive games, they'll have sets. They'll have the sets of
Yeah.
3s and 4s. They'll just, call everything there. So that's the strongest they can have, though.
So Rob, when you're talking about check raising here, it's really kind of cleaning up your equity for the players that you're ahead of, and we've got some redraw value.
You've got backdoor straight, backdoor flush. You've got and plus it's a backdoor nut flush, not to mention.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely have because of the cards you're playing right here, you have good board coverage and you cover this board pretty well. So yeah, I think there's people tend to only check raise when they hit 2-pair or sets. People very rarely check raise on these types of backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw type hands, whereas you can get a lot of folds if you check raise this, because the people that are c-betting are c-betting too much with too little. Because they're the initial aggressor, they feel they need the continuation bet because they're saying, well, see, I got aces, so I'm gonna bet because that's what their range has it, yours doesn't. But their range doesn't have this board and our range does. So we can really punish the people that c-bet too much.
Eric?
We kind of learned from Michael Acevedo that 6-high and 5-high flops are good to donk in, but those are good donking situations when you're big blind against a button raise. It's not a multi-way pot. With all these players in the pot, you don't want to donk and then get 2-bet and then 3-bet. It's better just to check, look at the action. If there's a shove and an all in, we can fold it if we really want to. I mean, we probably have a good hand where we could even call, but there's no reason to when it's a survival tournament. Check raising. I'm with Rob. Check raise all the way.
Yeah, I like that a lot too. And I mean, I think that's the big lesson here is that if we are learning a little bit about, we're kind of studying about kind of range advantage and some of these boards where we maybe do donk. We want to be really cognizant of that study and not start to apply it in places where it doesn't or can't belong. And there are boards where we as somebody in the blinds can donk out, and it can be like a very effective strategy, and it can really throw off our opponents. But it is, and I repeat, it is not a thing that we should be doing in like multi-way hands, especially 4 and 5 way hands. Um, we're the first to act here, and we're going to just be in such a better position here if we take a spot like Rob's discussing about like a check raise here. The thing I like about a check raise is it's hard for somebody to re-raise us, and on any deuce, any five, any ace, any four, and any
Club.
well, we have clubs, right? Any club, um, we can continue that story after a check raise. And that you might say, well, the same's true if I donk, right? But the problem with donking is that um we open up the opportunity for our opponents, I think, to raise us. And we should, unless we're going to be donking with like our entire range here, I think this is a spot where we really just don't want to be finding these kinds of spots. We want to let the action play out a little. The more multi-way a hand becomes, the more we want flow. We want to let it play within flow towards position, because we want the hand to sort of identify and the ranges to sort of solidify a little bit more. It helps us gain a little bit more information as the person with the least amount of information at the table.
And I mean, kudos to John for really considering all his options here. And I think that's something that John's come a long way as a player when it comes to sort of thinking about what are the available options available, and thinking multi-streets and examining everything in front of them. Because a lot of people do just sort of reflexively act, especially in spots like this. So I like that he's sort of pressing the edge of the envelope a little bit. Is this a spot where we ever donk, or is it just it's multi-way? It's like, even though it's a pretty good flop, we should just be play a little more straightforwardly.
My take is, like, in a 3-way pot, there might be a few donks. In a 4-way pot, I'd say, and you're in the like the small blind, that's where it stops. I mean, like, you just don't. You
Yeah.
just basically have 100% check at that point. I just don't think you're ever gonna.
Mhm.
I just don't think that's gonna be productive for you very much of the
And
time.
and what we're really doing is we're just comparing it to every other available action. And I think what we're saying is, in spots like this, we'd rather just include those hands that we're tempted to dunk into an already built and robust check raising range instead. And maybe that would be different if this was a heads up pot or something. But okay, so that's great, because I want to see if there were any donking candidates, like 5-6 or with a backdoor flush or something like that. But I think in multi-way, that one tip that you hear from people is just to sort of play a little more straightforwardly. Keith, did you want to add something there before we move on to the turn?
Yeah, I think that his assessment of his opposition has a lot to do with what he should do here too. As far as the check raise goes, if he was playing against in higher stakes against competent players in these multi-way pots, you need to protect a check raising range as well. You might want to just check call a lot of 2 pairs or sets and go with a check raise with something even higher, because if you are caught check raising with hands like that, then what do you have when you only call? You're going to get blown out of a lot of turns.
Yeah.
But with opponents like this, I think you can get away with it more.
Nice. All right, so John does donk. He leads 4 big blinds into a pot of 11, and under the gun calls, early position calls, and the other 2 players fold. So we go to the turn 3 ways with 23 big blinds in the pot. 52 behind, so we're at an SPR of a little over 2. Turn is the 6 of clubs. So we pick up the nut flush draw on the turn, and the board is 3, 4, 10, 6, 2 clubs. John says, our correspondent writes in, says, honestly, I think I misread this in real time to think it also gave me a wheel gut shot, which it does not. The voice in my head is saying you need to be more aggressive with nut flush draws. So we lead 17 and a quarter big blinds into the pot of 23 big blinds. So I like it. If you're going to be bluffing in spots like this is a good card for us. I like that we are making a non-trivial sizing when we choose to do this. Again, this feels like, and we have to consider as played when we donked the flop. If we had checked the flop, maybe it gets checked around, maybe it gets bet, and I think we take that opportunity to check raise that we were talking about. That would kind of change the SPR here in either of those cases. So I guess before we get into the results, does anyone have any thoughts on leading versus checking when we pick up the draw equity on the turn? That is kind of, I think, the bulk of what John's getting at here in his question. We've picked up equity. Now we've got the nut flush draw. Should we speed up or slow down? Eric, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think just 'cause this continues our story. This is why we bluff with equity. If you bluff the flop with equity, the reason you can continue with your bluff when you pick up equity on the turn. And the object of poker is to get your stacks in with the nuts. I mean, that's the object of this game. We have the nut draw, and we picked up, we're picking up equity. We need to figure out how to get the money in the pot when we have the nuts on the river. And the best way to do that is to lower the SPR to where we can shove the river when we get the nuts.
Rob?
I think this would have played out a heck of a lot better had we check raised, obviously. But as played, I didn't hear the question, what did they call me with?
Mm-hmm.
And that right there would tell me that, hey, I just picked up a lot of equity, but I don't have a hand yet. They called me when I bet out 4 big blinds into, a little over a third of a pot. And 2 people called me. So what'd they call me with? They call me with draws, they call me with 10s, they call me with 6s. They're going to call with those hands that may have connected somewhat with this board. And even though we do have the nut flush draw, that's not enough for us to go to battle with. I think it would be much better to check here and consider the size of any bets that come before we committed any more chips.
Chris?
One of the things I want to jump in there, because I love the way Rob is thinking here. What did they call me with? And so let's put those into some two categories of hands, right? There's like the hands that are value that are beating us, which are primarily 10x. There might be some sets in there, but they're primarily 10x. And they are hands that were draws. Well, there's something about nut flush draws as we get later in a hand, like early on in a hand when we have a nut flush draw, that when the refrain that John said is I've heard, or the voice in my head is saying you need to be more aggressive with nut flush draws. That is sort of that's something you should maybe be thinking as kind of the earlier in the hand, the more that's true, right? The later in a hand, the more this kind of hand actually starts to have some value. Now, this has even more value than a typical nut flush draw because we have a nut flush draw and a pair. So we are beating all of those draws at this point. We have a ton of equity getting ourselves to a river. I would like to take both the pair and flush equity that I have, being that I'm out of position, and check this back, or check this and see how this hand progresses with these other 2 players. because, well, I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is if they have the value portion of that range, they've got sets or 10x, how much are we betting that they're going to fold those, especially in a game like this where people are playing flop bingo and now they've hit bingo. Um, uh, I mean, I don't know that they would fold to a shove. Maybe they would, but I don't know. So I would much prefer a check here.
Yeah, we talk on the show from time to time about like good bluff spots. And I think we identified this flop as sort of like a pretty good bluff spot in a vacuum. Like it's a board that is hard to hit. There's not a lot of natural draws on it. So when we went for our semi bluff, it was a good spot. When people continue, you have to think about what that means. It means that they folded a bunch of their error that was in their range because we identified that they had a bunch of error and we made a small bet and they folded. So when they continue, what does that tell you about their continuing range? Well, it's going to be a lot stronger now. And it's going to be mostly weighted towards made hands. So like this reeks of a 10x hand. And maybe pocket nines or pocket eights or pocket sevens or something in there as well.
And
Chris?
yeah, the other thing is if it's really passive, like maybe they've got something like ace jack or something that, like some sort of hand that they're just hanging on. They've got
Yep.
two overs and they're calling flops. But then I would say if we want to try to get rid of those hands, we can bet small, and not bet as big as we did here.
Yeah. So we end up choosing this pretty large sizing on the turn, 17 and a quarter into 23, which I think is, as Chris says, it's bigger than it needs to be to get the junk to fold. And, we picked up a lot of equity here. And sometimes you think, okay, so this is one of the cards that we should continue on because we are continuing the story of strength from the flop. But maybe that's one of the reasons why check raising is better than leading in a spot like that, because you get to be much more confident when your opponents do continue that they do have a made hand, and then you don't try and get them off a top pair hand on the turn like this, because this does introduce kind of an unfortunate situation for us where we're only actually getting called when we are behind. I don't think there's any draws that are continuing to this, and all the two pair, top pair, or sets are beating us, and we're way behind. So that would be a factor that I was considering here. Chris, did you have something else before we move on? Okay, so we lead pretty big, and our opponent shoves. So we get the under the gun player shoves, and the under the gun player folds, and the early position player who called the original open raise comes over the top, and we have about the same number of chips because it was the second hand of the tournament. And then this, again, I don't think this is ever a bluff. I don't think there are enough bluff candidates that got here. It would have to be, let me see, the flop was 3, 4, 10, so it could be a hand like 5. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to find another 2 club hand that gets here that maybe had a straight draw. Like we've got the ace of clubs, so could it be like
He could have us pipped with ace 5.
yeah, but then we've got the pair, so we
Yeah,
feel
that's
great.
true. Yeah.
But they can't have ace 5 of clubs, so they could have, like, if they had 5, 7 of clubs, they'd have made the straight. If they have 7, 8 of clubs, I don't think they call the flop bet. So I mean, it's hard to come up with any draws that they can have here that they're turning into a bluff. And I don't think they're turning a hand like pocket 2s into a bluff, or ace 3 of spades or something like that we're beating. So I think it's just way too often it's a value hand that we're behind. Does anyone want to weigh
Yeah.
in before I show results here? Yeah, Eric.
Well, I agree. It's more than likely a 10, but I think we could have avoided this aggression from our opponent if we wouldn't have bet. Well, maybe not. We wouldn't have got all in if we wouldn't have bet so big.
Yeah, I think
Um,
if we check turn, which I think what Chris and Rob were saying earlier, then we get a chance to make a size-based decision because we might be getting the right odds to just call a turn bet if it's small enough.
Yeah, SPR is only 2. So, I mean, if
Yeah.
we bet a quarter pot, then we got a pot size shove at the end.
Yep. Yep. So as played, we do, and John says he think he was on tilt a little bit out of frustration. And he thinks he might have also misread the hand in real time to think that he had a wheel gut shot. So maybe he thought he had a few more outs. But the other player turns over 10 of diamonds, jack of diamonds for top pair, which I think makes perfect sense. If you go back as played, they called an early position open with 10 jack suited. They flopped top pair and called a small bet on a pretty dry board, and then pressed it on the turn and got called by a worse pair. So the river is no luck, the 6 of spades, giving our correspondent 6s and 4s, which falls to the out of position player or the in position player's 6s and 10s. And so we're out of the tournament. So John ends his post by saying, assuming this was a mistake somewhere down the line, exactly where was it? I'd hoped the turn bet was going to get all folds. I guess I expected a top pair to fold and felt like I was representing a small set, 3s or 4s, which I think that's the right mindset. I mean, that's the right thing to be thinking about. But then if you follow that through, John, then when they don't fold, I think that should be telling you that they do have a stronger hand. And I mean, I'm sensitive to John's position too, where now they shove, you've made this error in sizing that kind of puts you in jail a little bit, because now you're actually getting pretty good odds on the reshove from your opponent. You've still got the nut flush draw, and your ace is probably good if you hit, because that'll give you 2 pair. So you've actually got like 12 outs on the turn, if you count all your flush outs plus 3 aces plus a couple 4s, maybe you're still good there too. I mean, you have a lot of outs. Are people calling or folding in this spot? Because I struggle with this all the time. I was like, if I'd made a smaller bet, then the raise would be much bigger and I'd be getting worse odds and I could probably just get away from the hand. But now I've kind of put myself in jail a little bit because I'm actually getting pretty good odds. Do you guys struggle with that? Chris, you unmuted first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, if I played this hand like this down to the point where I got shoved on, I think we're getting the right odds to call this at this point. But I don't think we should be in this position either. So that I think, but if I get here, I think I just have to. This is one of those where you know you're behind, but you have to put the chips in anyway because you're getting good enough odds that, and you're gonna, I think you're good with any ace, any 4, and any club. So
that's what 14 outs, 28% equity on
Right.
I haven't done the math in my head.
That's
here.
a little less than a pot size bet. So
yeah.
But I have a question. If everybody wanted to check the turn, were we calling that? If we check the turn and our opponent bet the turn with his top pair,
depends on
For
the
the same-
sizing.
For that sizing, yeah, I think that is kind of sizing, and I think everything's on the table there. You could fold, call, or raise depending on what the sizing is.
Yep, agreed. And the other nice thing about checking here is I think one of the things we also have to remember about multi-way hands is that now I know people are just playing, some people aren't paying attention to this stuff at all. And that might be the case with this table, and John will know that better than anyone. But most people, when you're in a multi-way hand, not only are you stuck in that kind of shitty situation, so are they. And so they they have a lot of pressure on them. Like every bet you make in a multi-way situation is more meaningful than when you make it heads up, because you have to do it against multiple ranges and multiple players, all of which who can wake up with a hand. So this may just check through on a turn if we check it. Now, maybe not. Maybe they got top pair. They're probably going to bet this, but are they going to bet close to pot? I don't know. I don't know.
Yep, I think that's true, Keith.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, what I was gonna say earlier was that if we would check and then the other guy jammed, cards are making vapor trails to the mug. But if he makes a small bet, we might be able to call. It depends what kind of odds we're getting, really. What kind of implied odds? Because
Right.
we're still in a situation where we have implied odds, and they look pretty good with all those outs.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing that people I don't think realize either in a multi-way pot is you can't look at your hand as in a unique situation and say, I have this much equity with this hand, because your equity is spread amongst everybody at the table that has a hand.
Mm.
So, if you're heads up, it's pretty easy to know what kind of equity you have with the kind of hand you have. But when you have to dilute that over 4 different hands or 5 different hands, whatever it is, that dilutes everybody's equity. So you're not as strong as you think you are in a multi-way pot, no matter what you have.
Yeah,
Great
one of the
point.
greatest things to do is Equilab is a free program, and you can put in hand ranges and it tells you your equity. Just put in multiple players and watch your equity just get quartered. It just immediately, it's like you go from a 50% hand down to 25% hand, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
It's just amazing if you've never done it before.
Yeah, you can even
Yeah,
watch that happen to your pocket aces.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will just shout out Equilab's a fantastic free program. If you go to pokerstrategy.com, you can download it there. It was really the first tool I started messing around with many years ago, but it holds up really well for free range and hand equity realization and comparison stuff. Chris, you had something, I think, and
The
then Keith.
last thing I would say in terms of like just challenging John to think about this a little is he writes, I guess I expected a top pair to fold. And I think we have to go back to the beginning of our assessment of this hand, where we didn't want to 3-bet because too many people are calling us. And we're in a game where we have said multiple times, and lots of hands go 4 and 5 ways to the flop. Well, those are players who are doing what? They're making the mistake of calling too much. Do those sound like players who are going to fold top pair? Probably not. There are probably other ways we can take advantage of those types of players. Like if this player wants to get it in with Jack 10 on this board, I can't wait till I have ace 10 because I am getting stacks. So that's what we have to start to be looking out for. We have to start to value own players like this rather than try to get players like this to fold top pair. That's a hard ask, I think.
Yeah, and usually when we're picking these sort of semi-bluff spots, top pair might be included in the range of hands that we expect them to fold, but they also have a ton of other garbage hands that we expect them to fold. With the action that's taken place in this hand so far, they just don't have that wide a range. Top pair is making up a much bigger portion of their overall range at that point. And so getting them to fold it is, I think, even harder than if they had a bunch of other hands in their range that they might consider folding. Keith?
Yeah, I think that this conflict between the two different things that he said, I was expecting top pair to fold, but they were playing flop bingo. It's one of the things that you need to watch out for in your own thinking. It's kind of a mindset thing. In watch out for in your own thinking is the assumptions that you're making about your opponent, about the hand, they have to be congruent. It's like, just like keeping your story straight as you're playing through a hand, all of your assumptions also have to be congruent with each other. you can't assume two different things, because then you're just indulging in wishful thinking. They're playing flop bingo, but I expect them to fold top pair is a real good example of thinking that's not congruent.
Yeah, it's just like when you're hand ranging an opponent, every action, the funnel gets narrower, the range of hands they could have gets narrower. And you can't go in on the river and add in a hand that you excluded earlier in the hand. You can't give them a combo that you already excluded, because Keith is saying, just like our assumptions, they have to be consistent with each other, and you have to keep the stuff that you've excluded and kind of continue in that narrower universe of assumption and hand ranging. Rob?
And in that same vein, I think as amateur players, as recreational players, we all do this. We try to put the action of our opponent to what we want it to be. We
Yeah.
put their range of hands to the hands we want it to be, because we want this to happen, without actually considering what are they really going to do. You always think about that. Well, he could have this, he could have that, he could have that. I'm blocking this, I'm blocking that. That don't mean anything other than what that player is going to do. You're just projecting what you want to happen instead of realizing all the possibilities of actions.
Well said. Eric?
And one of my biggest hand reading tilts is projecting also, but it's projecting what I would do. Well, I would do this in this hand, so he's probably doing this. Well, he's not thinking that way. He's either 2 steps ahead of you or 2 steps behind you, probably.
That's a great way of thinking about it. It's
Yeah.
true. It's true. And sometimes we bring these like fancy plays, not fancy plays, but like sophisticated plays, like, semi bluffs and turning a made hand into a bluff. These are sophisticated techniques that sometimes they're a little too sophisticated for the opponents that we're playing against. And you can kind of just, level yourself a little bit. Just bring a rock to one of these fights against some of these players and just club them with a rock. That's as sophisticated as you need to get. Just hit value bet large with value hands. And sometimes it's just even good bluffing candidates, your hands. It might just not be as good a spot for it because it's just not the right fight to bring that weapon to. Keith?
Yeah. Sometimes when I'm about to make one of these mistakes where I'm engaging in wishful thinking or my thought process isn't congruent or something, once in a while I get that little voice inside my head that says, he's got a 10 and he ain't gonna fold it. I'm learning. I haven't got there yet, but I'm learning more and more to listen to that little voice.
Yeah.
Because that little voice, as you get more experience, is going to be right more often.
It's true.
So listen to that.
Yeah, the more we play, the more experience we get, the more experience our gut gets. The smarter our gut is, the more it's paying attention to the right things and helping us out with judgment calls. So don't feel like you're not. This is something that we've talked about before on the show. Listen to your gut. It doesn't mean you're not being analytical. You might just not be factoring in all the information that's available to your gut. The more you play, the smarter your gut gets. So trust your gut. Some fantastic work here in the forum post. We're just scratching the surface of this one, but there's a lot of really interesting factors to cover. I'd encourage our listeners, if you don't need to be a premium member, you don't even need to be a community member. I'll include the link to this post in the show notes. Just click on it and you can see everything else that John has to say about his play. He also does run this through Flopzilla, and against this in this exact spot, he does have a lot of equities. I'm not sure if it's exactly enough to actually make the call, but in this exact spot against this hand, it is that kind of blender situation that we were talking about, where now that you're in this position, it might actually be the right odds to call, even though you're going to lose the tournament a bunch. So the real key is to, earlier in the hand, avoid putting yourself in the position where calling is the right play, which is something that I think we all can work on. There's some really good responses here from Jamel, from Binkley, some good responses from John. Eric weighs in and shares a table of geometric bet sizing. I really encourage our listeners, if you like the way that we talk about poker, come check out the forums for free. Just part of being a free member here at Rec Poker. And I'd also say a lot of the Wrecking Crew members work as private coaches with with members of our audience all the time. It's something that we love to do. If you're listening along and you think, oh, I like the way that this group thinks about poker and talks about poker, you can go to rec.poker/coaching, and you'll find all sorts of different Wrecking Crew members, all available to work as coaches in whatever capacity you like, over Zoom, hand history reviews, database reviews. Lots of people that just love working with beginner and intermediate players like you. And there's really nothing like working with someone individually to bring some accountability, some structure to your studies, and to shine the light on the path ahead to help you get to the next level as quickly as possible. So on behalf of everyone on the Wrecking Crew, I hope some folks head on over to rec.poker/coaching and find someone to work with. And I want to thank Eric Anderson, Chris Jones, Rob Washam, and Keith Brandt for joining me in the booth for this podcast episode. Of course, the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, we couldn't do it without you. And 7high11, thanks for posting in the Rec Poker forums. And you, the listeners, thanks for tuning in from home. We'll see you again next week on the Rec Poker Podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody.